Unless Grandpa here can talk to ghosts, that radio's staying dead, Corporal Jake Turner said, the edge of his voice cutting through the dry afternoon air as a few of the younger Marines laughed under their breath, boots shifting on the sun-baked gravel of the training yard at Camp Holloway, the heat rising in wavering lines off the concrete like something alive. The comms antenna standing tall but silent against a washed-out blue sky, while a portable field radio sat open on a folding table. Its green display flickering with useless data that meant everything was working and yet nothing was. And just a few steps behind them stood an old man who hadn't said a word since he arrived. His posture relaxed but not weak, his faded denim jacket hanging loose over a plain shirt, sleeves worn thin at the cuffs, hands resting at his sides as if he had all the time in the world. His pale blue eyes fixed not on the Marines or the radio, but somewhere beyond them, watching the wind as it nudged a loose strip of tape on the antenna mast, subtle, almost invisible, but steady, like a signal most people didn't know how to read. And that was exactly why no one paid him any attention, not at first, not when the problem was supposed to be solved by software and diagnostics, and young men who trusted screens more than silence. Jake shook his head, tapping the side of the radio with 2 fingers as if that alone might force it back to life. We've run every check twice, he said, louder now more. For the audience than the machine. Signal chain is clean, power is stable, there's nothing left to fix unless it's just dead. Another Marine leaned in, squinting at the display. Maybe it's just old, he muttered, and that got another round of chuckles, the kind that filled space when frustration didn't have anywhere else to go. Jake glanced back over his shoulder then, finally noticing the old man standing there like he'd been part of the place long before any of them showed up. And something about that stillness, that complete lack of reaction, irritated him more than the broken radio. You need something, sir? He asked, but the word sir carried no respect, just formality stripped bare. The old man didn't answer right away, his gaze still on the antenna, on the way the wind curled around it in soft, inconsistent pulses, like it was trying to say something in a language the equipment couldn't translate. Jake smirked, folding his arms across his chest. Restricted area, he added, voice sharpening. Training exercise, not a museum tour. A couple of the Marines shifted, watching now, sensing the shift in tone. The old man finally turned his head, slow, deliberate, his eyes meeting Jake's with a calm that didn't challenge and didn't submit. It just was. And that, more than anything, made Jake lean forward slightly, as if trying to provoke a reaction he could understand. Radio's dead, Jake said, jerking a thumb toward the table. Unless you've got some magic trick from the Cold War, we've got it handled. The old man's voice, when it came, was low, rough with age but steady. It's not dead, he said, simple as that. No explanation, no performance, just a statement that landed heavier than it should have. One of the Marines let out a short laugh. Right, he said. It's just taking a nap. Jake's grin widened, seizing the moment. All right, he said, stepping closer, boots crunching softly on the gravel. Let's hear it then, his tone turning openly mocking now. What was your call sign, old man? The question hung in the air, light on the surface but sharp underneath, the kind of question meant to corner, to expose, to entertain the crowd more than find an answer. A few heads tilted, waiting. The wind shifted again, brushing past the antenna, tugging at that strip of tape in a different direction this time. And for a brief second, the old man's eyes flicked back to it before returning to Jake. The silence stretched just long enough to make the laughter start to fade at the edges. And then he spoke, quiet, almost too quiet for the open yard, but every word carried. Old Bear, he said, and nothing else. No explanation, no story, just the name. And for a heartbeat, nothing happened at all. No reaction, no laughter, just the sound of the wind moving through the range flags in the distance and the faint hum of a system that was supposed to be silent. For a moment, nothing broke the silence, not the wind, not the low hum of the equipment, not even the restless shifting of boots on gravel. And that was what made it different, because Marines were not good at silence, especially not the kind that arrived without warning. Jake Turner let out a short breath through his nose, half laugh, half dismissal, but it came out thinner than he intended. Old Bear, he repeated, like testing the weight of it, and finding nothing there. That is it. Huh. No rank, no unit, just a nickname. A few of the younger Marines picked it up, the laughter returning, but uneven now. One of them, shaking his head, sounds like something out of a camping trip. Another added, yeah. What is next? Smokey the Bear calling in air support. The jokes landed, but softer, like they were bouncing off something they could not quite see. The old man did not react, did not smile, did not correct them. He simply turned his gaze back toward the antenna, watching the slight pull of the wind against the loose strip of tape. As if the conversation had already passed him by, Jake noticed that, and it irritated him more than any insult could have, because it felt like being ignored, and being ignored in front of his own team was something he could not let stand. He stepped closer, closing the distance by a couple of feet, enough to make it clear this was no longer casual. You think this is funny? He asked, his tone sharpening. We are trying to run a live comms test out here, and you are giving me campfire stories. The old man's eyes shifted back to him again. Calm, steady, unreadable. You are listening to the wrong thing, he said, and the words were simple, but they landed with a strange weight. One of the Marines scoffed. We are listening to the radio, sir. That is kind of the point, another added, tapping the side of his headset. Nothing coming through. It is dead air. The old man tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, but like he was considering how much to say. It is not the air that is dead, he said quietly. It is how you are reading it. Jake opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, a faint crackle slipped through the radio speaker, so soft it could have been mistaken for static, but it was different, irregular, almost like a breath caught between words. Every head turned at once. The laughter died instantly this time, replaced by something tighter, more focused. Jake frowned, stepping toward the table, eyes locked on the display. Did you just hear that? One of the Marines asked, already reaching for the volume knob. Turning it up a notch, the speaker hissed, then fell quiet again. Jake shook his head. Probably interference, he said quickly. Too quickly, like he needed it to be true. But then it came again, a sharper crackle, followed by a fragment of sound that almost formed a word before dissolving back into noise. The kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up without giving you a reason why. Behind them, Staff Sergeant Cole Ramirez had been watching the entire exchange without saying a word, his arms crossed, his expression neutral at first, but now something had changed. His eyes had narrowed slightly, not at the radio, but at the old man, at the way he stood there without surprise, without curiosity, like he had been expecting this all along. Ramirez had seen that kind of stillness before, not on training grounds, but in places where experience ran deeper than rank, where people did not react because they already knew what was coming next. He took a slow step forward, his boots making almost no sound, his gaze fixed on the old man's face. Say that again, Ramirez said, his voice low, controlled, not directed at Jake, not even at the group, but at the man who had not moved. The old man looked at him this time, really looked, and for the first time there was the faintest shift in his expression, not emotion exactly, but recognition, like two people noticing the same thing at the same moment. Old Bear, he said again, just as quiet as before, and this time, Ramirez did not blink, did not smile, did not question it, because somewhere deep in the back of his mind, a memory he could not fully place had just started to surface, and it did not feel like a story. The air seemed to tighten around them, not with noise but with attention, every set of eyes now fixed on the old man, as if the ground beneath the training yard had shifted just enough to make everyone aware of it. The radio gave another uneven crackle, sharper this time, followed by a thin thread of sound that almost resembled a voice before breaking apart into static, and no one laughed now, not even the ones who had started it. Jake Turner stood still for a second longer than he intended, his jaw set, his confidence trying to reassert itself against something he could not quite define. It is interference, he said again, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something that sounded more like insistence. He reached down and adjusted the frequency dial with controlled, deliberate movements, as if precision alone could force the problem into submission. The display flickered, numbers shifting in clean digital order, but the sound that followed was anything but clean, a low murmur buried under static, like a distant conversation bleeding through layers of time. One of the Marines swallowed hard. That is not normal, he said quietly. And this time no one corrected him. Ramirez stepped closer to the table, his presence steady, grounded, the kind of weight that came from years of knowing when something did not add up. He did not touch the radio, did not adjust anything. He just listened, his head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to pull meaning out of the noise. Then he looked back at the old man again, longer this time, studying him, the worn jacket, the still hands, the eyes that were not searching but remembering. "Where did you serve?" Ramirez asked, his voice low but firm, not a challenge, not an accusation, but a question that carried respect whether he intended it or not. The old man did not answer right away, his gaze drifting once more to the antenna, to the way the wind shifted direction in small, inconsistent patterns, different places, he said finally. And it was not evasive, just incomplete, like the rest of the story did not belong here. Jake exhaled sharply, stepping back from the table, frustration edging back into his posture. "We are not doing this," he said, gesturing toward the radio. "We have a malfunction, not a history lesson." But even as he spoke, the radio came alive again, louder now, the static thinning just enough for something underneath to push through, a voice, faint, aged, carrying a weight that did not belong to the present. "Repeat. Identify." The words were broken, stretched thin by distance or time or something else entirely. But they were unmistakably human. Every Marine froze, not out of discipline but instinct, the kind that kicked in before thought had a chance to catch up. Jake's hand hovered over the controls, but he did not touch them. For the first time since this started, he was not trying to fix it. He was trying to understand it. Ramirez leaned in slightly, his voice steady as he spoke toward the radio. "This is training frequency Echo 7. Identify yourself." The response did not come. Immediately, the static surged, then dipped, and then the voice returned, clearer this time, still distant but focused, like it had locked onto something. "Echo 7. It said slowly, testing the words. And then there was a pause, a long one, the kind that stretched just enough to make every second feel deliberate. "Who called Old Bear?" The question landed in the center of the group like a weight no one could see, but everyone felt. Jake's throat tightened, his earlier smirk gone. Completely now, replaced by something closer to unease. He glanced at Ramirez, expecting an answer, a command, something to re-establish control, but Ramirez was not looking at him. His eyes were fixed on the old man, and there was no doubt in them anymore, no uncertainty, just recognition, quiet and absolute, the kind that did not need confirmation because it had already found it. The old man took a single step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just measured, like crossing a line that had always been there, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, close enough to the radio to be heard without raising his voice. "I did," he said, calm, steady, and for the first time since the radio had come alive, the static did not swallow the words, it carried them. The response did not come immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any noise the radio had made so far, the kind of pause that did not feel empty but measured, as if something on the other end was adjusting, confirming, remembering. The static softened into a low, steady hiss, no longer chaotic but controlled, like a channel had finally been opened instead of forced, and when the voice returned it was different, clearer, steadier, no longer searching but certain. "Old Bear." It said, slower now, each word placed with care, "confirm identity." Every Marine at the table stood completely still, not because they were ordered to, but because something deeper had taken hold, the kind of instinct that recognized significance before understanding it. Jake Turner felt it most of all, the shift from a situation he controlled to one he did not. His eyes moved from the radio to the old man and back again, trying to reconcile the two, the worn jacket and the steady voice. The quiet presence and the reaction it had triggered, none of it fit the version of reality he had been operating in just minutes ago. "This is not part of the exercise," Jake said, but his voice was lower now, uncertain, almost like he was asking rather than stating. Ramirez did not respond to him, his focus locked entirely on the old man, watching not just what he said, but how he stood, how he breathed, how he did not rush. The old man leaned slightly closer to the radio, not dramatic, not performative, just enough to be heard clearly. "Arthur Hayes," he said, his tone unchanged, calm, grounded. like he had spoken that name into radios before and expected it to be recognized. The static dipped again, then rose in a brief surge, and then the voice came back with a sharp clarity that cut through the entire yard. Arthur Hayes. A pause followed, shorter this time, but heavier, like the weight of years was being compressed into a single moment. Old Bear, you are not scheduled to be on any active channel. The words were formal, controlled, but beneath them there was something else, something that sounded like disbelief held tightly in check. Ramirez inhaled slowly, his posture straightening without conscious thought. Jake noticed it, the subtle change. The way a staff sergeant who had been observing now looked like he was standing in front of something far above routine training. One of the younger Marines shifted his weight, whispering under his breath, "Who is that?" But no one answered, because the answer was starting to form on its own. The old man did not react to the statement, did not defend or explain. He simply glanced once more at the antenna, then back to the radio. "Your signal is drifting," he said, almost conversational. "You are reading clean on your end, but you are not accounting for the crosswind at about 30 feet. There was a brief silence on the other end, not confusion this time, but processing, the kind that happened when someone realized they were being corrected by someone who should not have been there, and yet clearly knew exactly what they were talking about. The voice returned, sharper now. "Stand by," it said, and then the channel went quiet again. Not dead, just waiting. Jake stared at the radio, then at the antenna, then back at the old man, his earlier confidence completely gone now, replaced by something he did not want to name. "How did you know that?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The old man did not look at him. "Because you are listening to the machine," he said, "not the air." Ramirez felt that settle into place, not as a lesson but as confirmation, and in that moment he made a decision, quiet, immediate. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with controlled precision, turning slightly away from the group, his thumb moving quickly across the screen as he brought up a number he had not used in a long time. A direct line he had been told to use only if something did not make sense in a way that mattered. He did not announce it, did not explain, he just waited for the call to connect, his eyes never leaving Arthur Hayes as the wind shifted again and the antenna adjusted with it, as if it too was finally listening. Ramirez turned just enough to shield the call from the others, his voice low and controlled as the line connected. "This is Staff Sergeant Cole Ramirez at Camp Holloway. I need confirmation on a call sign." There was a brief pause, then a crisp response on the other end, professional, alert. "Go ahead." Ramirez's eyes remained fixed on the old man as he spoke. "Call sign Old Bear." "Repeat." "Old Bear," associated with the name Arthur Hayes. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, not the kind of pause caused by a bad connection, but the kind that came when a question hit something sensitive, something buried deep in systems that were not accessed lightly. Jake watched him from a few feet away, the tension now fully visible in his posture, arms no longer crossed, shoulders slightly forward, like he was bracing for something he did not understand. The other Marines stood still, their earlier energy gone, replaced by a quiet focus that felt heavier than any command. On the table, the radio remained active but silent, its faint hum blending with the sound of the wind moving across the open yard. The antenna shifted again, the loose strip of tape fluttering in short, uneven motions, and the old man watched it the same way he had from the beginning. Not distracted, not impatient, just present, as if everything unfolding around him was already accounted for. Ramirez finally received a response, but it was not the same voice as before. This one was tighter, more deliberate. "Stand by, Staff Sergeant," it said, and then the line went quiet again, a second layer of waiting settling over the first. Ramirez lowered the phone slightly, but did not end the call, his grip steady, his breathing even. Jake took a step closer, unable to hold back any longer. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice no longer sharp, no longer mocking, just direct, searching. Ramirez did not answer right away, his attention split between the call and the man standing a few feet away. The name Arthur Hayes no longer just a name but a key that had unlocked something he could feel, but not yet see. The radio crackled softly again, but this time no voice followed, just a steady presence, like a channel being held open, waiting for the right moment. The old man shifted his weight slightly, one small adjustment that carried the ease. of someone who had stood in places like this before, who understood that waiting was not inactivity but part of the process. Jake exhaled slowly, running a hand along the back of his neck, the heat no longer the only thing pressing against him. "You could have just said who you were," he muttered, not accusing, not fully, but there was a trace of frustration there. The old man glanced at him briefly, not unkind, just measured. "I did," he said, and there was no edge to it, no correction, just a simple statement that left no room for argument. Ramirez's phone came back to life with a sharp, immediate tone, the kind that cut through everything else. He raised it back to his ear instantly, his posture straightening without conscious thought. "Staff Sergeant Ramirez," he said, and the voice that answered was different again, deeper, older, carrying authority that did not need to announce itself. "Do not move," it said, each word clear, controlled, final. "Maintain your position and keep that channel open." Ramirez's grip tightened slightly. "Yes, sir," he replied, the response automatic, precise. Jake felt it then, the shift he had been trying to ignore becoming impossible to deny. This was no longer a broken radio, no longer a training hiccup. This was something else entirely. Something that had reached beyond their small section of the base and pulled something back. Something that moved faster than explanation. The line on Ramirez's phone went quiet again. But this time it was not waiting. It was moving. Somewhere beyond the horizon of their understanding, decisions were being made. And for the first time since the old man had spoken those two words, no one in that yard doubted that they mattered. The waiting changed shape after that call, no longer uncertain but directed, like an invisible line had been drawn around the small group at the training yard, holding them in place while something far beyond them moved into alignment. The radio stayed open, its quiet hum steady now, no longer erratic, as if it had found the exact frequency it had been searching for all along, and no one touched it. Not Jake, not the other Marines, not even Ramirez, who stood with his phone lowered but ready. His posture sharper than before, his instincts no longer questioning but confirming. Jake shifted his weight, the gravel crunching softly under his boots, the sound unusually loud in the stillness. He looked at the old man again. Really looked this time, not at the worn clothes or the age in his hands, but at the way he carried himself, the absence of tension, the complete lack of need to prove anything. And it unsettled him more than the voice on the radio ever could. "You knew this would happen," Jake said, the words coming out slower than he intended. Not an accusation but a realization forming as he spoke. The old man did not answer immediately, his eyes still tracking the antenna as the wind shifted direction again. A subtle change that most would miss, but he seemed to follow as naturally as breathing. "I knew someone would answer," he said at last. And that was all. Simple, precise, final. One of the younger Marines glanced between them, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by quiet uncertainty. "Answer what?" he asked under his breath. But no one responded, because the question no longer felt important. The answer was already unfolding. A distant sound began to rise beyond the edge of the base, faint at first, barely noticeable against the open sky, but steady, rhythmic, growing with each passing second. Jake turned his head slightly, his brow tightening as he tried to place it. It was not a vehicle, not ground movement. It came from above, low and controlled, cutting through the air with a presence that demanded attention without needing to announce itself. Ramirez heard it too, his eyes lifting toward the horizon for just a fraction of a second before returning to the old man. Confirmation layered on top of everything else, the call, the voice, the recognition. Now this. The pieces were locking into place faster than explanation could keep up. The radio crackled. Again, not with interference, but with intent. The same voice as before, clearer now, closer. "Old Bear, remain on channel," it said, the tone no longer questioning, no longer verifying, but acknowledging, as if the name itself had shifted the entire frame of the conversation. The old man did not reach for the radio, did not adjust anything. He simply inclined his head slightly, as if the message had been received without needing to respond. Jake felt the last of his earlier certainty slip away, replaced by something heavier, something that settled in his chest and stayed there. Not fear exactly, but respect forming in real time, uninvited and undeniable. "Who are you?" he asked again, quieter now, the edge gone completely. And this time the question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like someone trying to understand the ground beneath their own feet. The old man finally looked at him fully, his expression unchanged but his gaze steady. Someone who learned to listen before. The noise, he said, and the words did not explain anything, and yet they explained everything that mattered. The sound in the sky grew louder now, no longer distant. The air itself carrying the low, controlled rhythm of approaching rotors, steady and precise, not hurried, not searching, but arriving with purpose, and every Marine on that line felt it at the same moment, the shift from routine to something else entirely, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood, something that had already decided to be there before anyone on that ground realized why. The sound in the sky grew from a distant rhythm into a defined presence, the steady rotation of blades cutting through the afternoon heat with controlled precision, not rushed, not aggressive, but undeniable. Every Marine on the line turned instinctively now, eyes tracking upward and outward toward the far edge of the base, where the horizon shimmered in the sun, and then it appeared, low and deliberate, a dark silhouette moving against the pale sky, descending with a confidence that did not need clearance shouted or permission repeated. It simply came because it had already been authorized somewhere far above their level. Jake Turner felt his chest tighten as the realization settled in. This was not routine, not scheduled, not something you joked about or explained away with interference. This was response, real response, and it was coming directly to them. Ramirez did not move, his posture locked, his attention still anchored to Arthur Hayes even as the helicopter closed the distance, because whatever was arriving out of the sky was not the source of this moment. It was the reaction to it. The radio crackled again, the voice sharper now, closer, no distortion left. Maintain position, do not disperse, it said, and the authority in it left no room for interpretation, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to command compliance. The younger Marines straightened unconsciously, their bodies responding before their thoughts could catch up. Jake swallowed, his earlier words replaying in his mind in fragments that no longer fit the reality in front of him. The laughter, the mocking tone, the casual dismissal, all of it felt distant now, like something said by someone else, someone who had not yet understood what he was standing in. The helicopter descended into a controlled hover just beyond the training yard, the air shifting as the rotor wash rolled across the ground, lifting dust and loose gravel in tight spirals that danced and settled again. In uneven patterns, the antenna flexed slightly under the changing air currents, the strip of tape snapping once before falling still again. And through all of it, Arthur Hayes did not move, not even a step, his stance unchanged, his eyes steady. As if this was simply the continuation of something that had already begun long before anyone else noticed. The landing gear touched down with measured precision. No rush, no drama, just finality. The engine noise settling into a lower, steady hum as the blades continued their controlled rotation. A side door opened, and for a moment no one stepped out, the kind of pause that carried intention rather than hesitation. Then a figure emerged, uniform crisp, posture exact, moving with purpose but without urgency. Each step calculated, each motion aligned with a chain of command that extended far beyond the small group watching in silence. Ramirez's breath slowed, his instincts confirming what his mind had already accepted. This was not a verification anymore. This was acknowledgement at the highest level present. Jake felt it fully now, the weight of the situation pressing down on every assumption he had made just minutes earlier. He took a half step back, without realizing it, not out of fear alone but out of something deeper, a recognition that he was no longer the center of this moment, that he had never been. The figure moved closer across the gravel, the sound of boots deliberate, measured, and every Marine along that line straightened further, their posture aligning instinctively, not from command but from presence. The radio remained open on the table, silent now, no longer needing to speak, because whatever needed to be said had already arrived in person, and Arthur Hayes finally shifted his gaze from the antenna to the approaching figure, not with surprise, not with anticipation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had been expecting this all along. The figure did not rush as he approached, each step deliberate, boots pressing into the gravel with a steady rhythm that seemed to quiet everything else around it. Even the low hum of the helicopter felt secondary now, like background noise to something far more precise unfolding in front of them. The Marines instinctively straightened further, spines aligning, shoulders locking into place without a word being spoken. Because presence like that did not require instruction, it demanded recognition. Jake Turner felt it most sharply, the shift from confusion to clarity hitting him all at once. This was not just an officer, not just another link in the chain. This was someone who carried authority that moved entire systems, and that authority was walking directly toward the old man he had mocked minutes earlier. Ramirez's stance became exact, controlled, every detail of his posture reflecting discipline earned over years. But even he did not step forward, did not interrupt, because this moment was no longer his to manage. The figure stopped a few feet in front of Arthur Hayes, close enough that the distance between them carried meaning, not space but recognition. For a brief second, nothing happened. No salute, no words, just two men, standing across from each other while the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears, each second stretching longer than it should, his mind replaying everything he had said, every laugh, every dismissive glance, and none of it fit anymore. None of it belonged in this moment. The figure's eyes moved over Arthur Hayes, not scanning, not assessing, but confirming, like reading something already known rather than discovering something new. And then, without announcement, without ceremony, the figure came to a sharp, precise halt, his posture snapping into full alignment, and he raised his hand in a clean, exact salute, held steady, unwavering, the kind of salute that was not routine but intentional, not given lightly, but earned long before this moment. A shock moved through the line of Marines, silent but undeniable, because they understood what that meant even if they did not yet understand why. Jake felt it like a physical force, his breath catching, his body reacting before his thoughts could follow, because in everything he had learned, in every drill, every standard, that kind of salute only went one direction, and it was not supposed to start here, not from someone like that, not toward a man in a worn jacket standing quietly by a broken radio. Arthur Hayes did not react immediately. He did not snap to attention, did not mirror the motion with urgency. He simply looked at the man in front of him, his expression unchanged, his eyes steady. And then, slowly, with the same measured control he had carried from the beginning, he returned the salute, not exaggerated, not delayed, just precise, exact, equal. The movement carried a weight that settled over the entire yard, heavier than any command that could have been shouted, heavier than any explanation that could have been given. The helicopter continued its steady hum in the background. The antenna stood still now, the strip of tape no longer moving, as if even the wind had decided to stop interfering. Jake took another step back without realizing it. Then another, his earlier confidence gone completely, replaced by something deeper, something that did not need a name, the kind of understanding that arrived without permission, that this moment had never been about him, never been about the radio, never been about a training exercise. It had been about a name, two words spoken quietly into the air, and everything that followed had simply been the world catching up to it. The figure lowered his salute with the same precision he had raised it, but the silence remained, not empty, not uncertain, but absolute. And in that silence, every Marine on that line understood that something had just been revealed that no amount of rank or technology could have uncovered on its own. The salute ended, but the silence did not. It lingered in the air like something solid, something that pressed against every man standing there and held them exactly where they were. The figure lowered his hand and took one measured step closer, his voice calm, controlled, carrying without effort. "It has been a long time, sir," he said, and the word sir was not protocol, it was respect, the kind that could not be written into regulations. Arthur Hayes gave a small nod, nothing exaggerated, just acknowledgement. "Long enough," he replied, his voice as steady as it had been from the beginning, as if the years between then and now had never needed to be explained. The officer's gaze held for a moment longer, then shifted briefly toward the radio, the antenna, the setup that had brought everything to this point. "They said the signal would not hold," he said, almost to himself. "They said the conditions were too unstable. Arthur's eyes followed the same line for a fraction of a second before returning. "Conditions always change," he said. "That is why you listened first." The officer gave the faintest hint of a smile, not amusement, but recognition, like hearing something familiar spoken in exactly the right way. Behind them, the Marines stood frozen in place, not by order, but by understanding. Jake Turner felt it settle fully now, the weight of everything he had missed. The way he had looked at the old man and seen nothing worth noticing. The way he had spoken without thinking, and how quickly that version of reality had collapsed. He took a slow breath, then stepped forward just enough to be heard, his voice lower now, stripped of everything it had carried before. "Sir," he said, the word careful, deliberate. "I did not know." Arthur turned his head slightly, looking at him without judgment, without dismissal, just seeing him as he was in that moment. "You were not supposed to," he said, and there was no edge to it, no correction, just truth. Jake swallowed, the tension in his chest easing just enough to let something else take its place, something quieter, something that felt more like learning than defending. The officer glanced at Jake briefly, then back to Arthur. "They still use your methods," he said. "Not officially, not on paper, but the ones who last, they learn to listen the way you did." Arthur said nothing to that, just a slight shift in his stance, as if the conversation had already said everything it needed to. The helicopter idled behind them, the steady rotation of its blades now just part of the background, no longer the center of attention, because the moment had already peaked, and what remained was the understanding it left behind. Ramirez finally exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing as the pieces settled into place, not fully explained, not documented, but clear enough to matter. The radio sat quiet on the table, its purpose fulfilled without ever being repaired, because it had never been broken in the way they thought. Jake looked at it one last time, then back at Arthur Hayes, seeing not an old man, not a stranger, but something else entirely, something that did not need rank displayed or credentials announced, something that carried its own authority without asking for recognition. Arthur turned slightly, his gaze returning once more to the antenna, to the wind that had never stopped moving even when no one else noticed. And for a brief moment, the entire yard felt still, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered already had. And as the officer stepped back and the Marines instinctively adjusted their posture, the lesson remained without being spoken, settling quietly into the space between them, where it would stay long after the helicopter lifted and the noise returned, a truth simple enough to miss and strong enough to last. That respect is not something you demand. It is something you recognize when you finally learn how to listen.